Hello, welcome to Exposed News Outlet. My name is Andrea and I will be your host. There's a lot I would like to discuss today about cult ideology and dangers that it brings, as well as why it's important not to obey in advance, as well as signs of brainwashing, propaganda, and more. But before I do, if I could just ask if you could please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. It really helps me out a lot and helps to get my message out into the algorithms as well. If you could also smash the like button and share on your social media platforms, I would appreciate it deeply. Thank you. Also, with the rise of prices and this new administration that will simply exacerbate inflation instead of fixing them in an ever growing world of disinformation and chaos, it's more important to support independent journalists and media, as well as cross referencing, etc. Technology being expensive, I have been trying to grow my resources as quickly as possible. However, technology is pretty pricey. I have started a GoFundMe. If you could, please help support independent, truth-driven journalism, empower a transgender voice in a fight for democracy and civil rights. In today's world where misinformation spreads like wildfire and hate-fueled narratives dominate the headlines, independent voices that fight for truth are more important than ever. I am a transgender journalist on a mission to provide quality, fact-based news that challenges the status quo and brings clarity to the stories that matter. As a member of the LGBTQ plus community, I understand firsthand the need for honest, inclusive, empowering journalism that defends civil rights, equality, and freedom. But to make this vision a reality, I need your help. As an independent journalist, I'm building a media platform that cuts through the noise and provides real, unbiased coverage, especially on issues that affect marginalized communities, including transgender people. The equipment and software needed to produce high quality content and ensure professional editing and run a credible platform are costly. And every day I work toward making this a sustainable reality. Your donation will help me secure the essential tools required to invest in professional equipment and software to produce clear, engaging, and impactful videos and articles. Counter the rising tide of disinformation and anti-transgender propaganda with facts, truth, and personal stories that empower those most affected. Keep independent journalism alive by ensuring that voices like mine and others from marginalized communities are heard, respected, and have the resources to make a real impact. This is not just about supporting my platform. This is standing up for the values that shape a healthy democracy: truth, transparency, civil rights, and equality. In a world where mainstream media is often compromised or corrupted, independent journalists have a crucial role in making sure that the facts reach the people who need them most. Together, we can build a future where every voice is heard, where misinformation doesn't have the final say, and where civil rights, especially for transgender people, are not just protected but celebrated. Please donate today and help me continue to fight for truth, freedom, and democracy. Your support is more than just a financial contribution. It's a commitment to a more informed, more inclusive world. Thank you for believing in the power of independent journalism. I will link my GoFundMe in the description box below for those of you who are able to, and thanks again. I wouldn't be able to do this without you. And now, without further ado, let's get to the video. Psychological manipulation and tactics employed by those with harmful authoritarian or extremist ideologies are deeply disturbing, but can be insightful when we understand the mechanisms at play. Master manipulators, including leaders of hate groups, often use subtle but powerful techniques to control their followers, spread their dangerous ideologies, and perpetuate oppression. These figures often disguise their true motives, hiding their agendas behind a facade of good intentions. nationalism, or even religious rhetoric. By doing so, they create a sense of legitimacy and morality around their policies, masking their underlying goals of power consolidation and the marginalization of certain groups, particularly minorities and the poor. Key psychological tactics used by manipulative leaders include: number one, coded language and dog whistles. A common technique used by manipulative leaders, especially those with white nationalist or racist agendas, is the use of coded language. This includes subtle phrasing or symbolic references that may sound benign or patriotic to the average listener, but carry hidden, often harmful meanings to those familiar with the underlying ideology. For example, phrases like taking back our country or protecting our heritage or making America great again can mask a more sinister agenda of exclusion, oppression, or inequality. These slogans and messages appeal to a deep sense of nostalgia or fear of change, but they are often veiled attempts to rally support for policies that disproportionately benefit the wealthy, particularly the white elites, while scapegoating minorities. Number two, appealing to the good intentions of nationalism or conservatism. Charismatic and manipulative leaders often present themselves as champions of traditional values or portraying their cause as one that seeks to protect families, communities, or the natural order. They often tap into deep seated fears of cultural, economic, and demographic change, positioning themselves as defenders of a pure or authentic national identity. By framing themselves as protectors, they convince many that their intentions are benevolent, even while they secretly pursue policies that disproportionately benefit the rich and perpetuate systematic inequality. This creates a false dichotomy where dissenters or critics are portrayed as unpatriotic or out of touch with the values of the nation. Number three, creating division and othering. One of the most dangerous tactics employed by these leaders is the dehumanization of the other, whether that's immigrants, people of color, LGBTQ plus individuals, or other marginalized groups. By portraying certain communities as inherently dangerous or inferior, these leaders manipulate their followers into seeing these people as a threat to their way of life. Xenophobia, racism, and misogyny are central to this process, as it allows manipulators to justify discriminatory policies that divide society and solidify their power. Over time, this othering process desensitizes the public, making extreme or violent actions seem justified in the name of security or preserving society. Number four, playing in economic inequality and class tensions. Manipulative leaders often frame their policies as solutions to economic problems, but their solutions tend to favor the elite class. For example, tax cuts for the rich, deregulation of industries, and privatization of public services can be sold to the public as efforts to promote prosperity for everyone. However, in reality, these policies primarily benefit the wealthy, particularly white elites, while leaving the working class and marginalized groups further impoverished. Leaders might even paint the wealthy as hardworking and deserving of their privileges, while casting the poor and disenfranchised as lazy and undeserving. Number five, rhetoric of punishment and law and order. Often these leaders use punitive rhetoric to justify harsh measures against their perceived enemies. Whether it's immigrants, protesters, or political dissidents, they may push for laws that increase surveillance, incarceration, or violent crackdowns on protests and movements advocating for social justice. This rhetoric is typically cloaked in a call for law and order, but the underlying aim is to suppress dissent and maintain the power dynamics that benefit the elites. Punitive measures are normalized as necessary to restore the country. But in reality, they serve to enforce a social order where the wealthy remain in control and the oppressed stay subjugated. Let me play this clip.
I want to talk to you about the F word. No, not that F word. I'm talking about fascism. Is Donald Trump really a fascist, as some would say? Or is the word authoritarian sufficient? The term fascism is often used loosely, but you can generally identify fascists by their hate of the other, vengeful nationalism, and repression of dissent. To fight these ideas, we need to be aware of what they are and how they fit together. Let's examine the 5 elements that define fascism and what makes it distinct from and more dangerous than authoritarianism. First, the rejection of democracy in favor of a strongman. Authoritarians believe strong leaders are needed to maintain stability, so they empower strongmen, dictators, or absolute monarchs to maintain social order through the use of force. But fascists view strong leaders as the means of discovering what society needs. They regard the leader as the embodiment of society, the voice of the people.
I am your voice. I alone can fix it.
Second, stoking rage against cultural elites. Authoritarian movements cannot succeed without at least some buy-in from establishment elites. While fascist movements often seek to co-opt the establishment, they largely depend on fueling resentment and anger against presumed cultural elites for supposedly displacing regular people. Fascists rile up their followers to seek revenge on the elites.
The out-of-touch media elites, the political elites, but the elites from the elites who led us from one financial and foreign policy disaster to another.
They create mass political parties and demand participation. They encourage violence.
You know what they used to do to guys like that when they were in a place like this? They'd be carried out on a stretcher, folks. Like to punch him in the face, I'll tell you. Knock the crap out of him, would you? And we fight. We fight like hell.
Third, nationalism based on superior race and historic bloodlines. Authoritarians see nationalism as a means of asserting the power of the state. For fascists, the state embodies what is considered a superior group based on race, religion, and historic bloodlines. To fascists, the state is a means of asserting that superiority.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you.
Fascists worry about disloyalty and replacement by groups that don't share the same race or bloodlines.
And I think any Jewish people that vote for a Democrat, I think it shows either a total lack of knowledge or great disloyalty.
Fascists encourage their followers to scapegoat, expel, and sometimes even kill such others. Fourth, extolling brute strength and heroic warriors. The goal of authoritarianism is to gain and maintain state power at any cost. For authoritarians, strength comes in the form of large standing armies that can enforce their rule. They seek power to wield power. Fascists seek state power to achieve their ostensible goal, achieving their vision of society. Fascism accomplishes this by rewarding those who win economically and physically, and denigrating or even exterminating those who lose. Fascism depends on organized bullying, a form of social Darwinism.
Our people are tougher and stronger and meaner and smarter.
For the fascist, war and violence are means of strengthening society by culling the weak and glorifying heroic warriors.
I am your warrior. I am your justice. I am your retribution. I am your retribution.
Fifth and finally, disdain of women and LGBTQ plus people. Authoritarianism imposes hierarchies. It's about order. Fascism's idea of order is organized around a particular hierarchy of male dominance. The fascist heroic warrior is male. Women are relegated to subservient roles. In fascism, anything that challenges the traditional heroic male roles of protector, provider, and controller of the family is considered a threat to the social order. Fascism seeks to eliminate homosexuals, non-binary, transgender, and queer people because they are thought to challenge or weaken the heroic male warrior.
I will ask Congress to pass a bill establishing that the only genders recognized by the United States government are male and female, and they are assigned at birth.
These 5 elements of fascism fit together and reinforce each other. Rejection of democracy in favor of a strong man depends on galvanizing popular rage. Popular rage draws on a nationalism based on a supposed superior race or ethnicity. That superior race or ethnicity is justified by a social Darwinist idea of strength and violence, as exemplified by heroic warriors. Strength, violence, and the heroic warrior are centered on male power. These 5 elements find exact expression in Donald Trump. His uniquely American version of fascism is rooted largely in white Christian nationalism. It is the direction that most of the Republican Party is now heading in. It's not enough to call Trump and those promoting his ideas authoritarians, when what they are really advocating is something far worse: fascism.
Fascism is a cult of the leader who promises national restoration in the face of supposed humiliation by immigrants, leftists, liberals, minorities, homosexuals, women, in the face of what the fascist leader says is a takeover of the country's media, cultural institutions, schools by these forces. And that's why you need a really macho, powerful, violent response. The fascist leader says he will solve the problem. Fascism is right-wing by nature. It's based on ultranationalism. However, you can have ultranationalist movements that are ultranationalist movements of minority groups. There is left-wing authoritarianism. There are bad things on the left. Stalin killed many, many people. Mao killed many, many people. These are terrible figures, but not all terrible things are fascist. Fascism is a very particular ideological structure. When thinking about fascism, you can't think about these individual elements in isolation. They come as a bundle. My name is Jason Stanley. I'm the Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University and the author of 5 books, most recently, How Fascism Works: The Politics of Us and Them. We forget that many fascist regimes started off as democratic political parties. We forget that Hitler, the Nazi Party, ran in an election. Fascist parties start as fascist social and political movements before they come to power. So it's important to see that these tactics occur even in societies that do not have a fascist regime. All nationalism involves a mythic past. So you can say, look, we're Polish people, people who spoke Polish and were sheep herders, and another bunch of Polish people who were fishermen. You can talk about how things were wonderful when we were all Polish together. That's a fine mythic past. But then there's the fascist mythic past. In the past, we were great. Wherein did our greatness consist? In our military. And in the past, the dominant racial group ruled over others. And then the fascist leader says, that has been taken from you by the leftists and communists. They want to weaken our military. They want to weaken our greatness. Propaganda is ubiquitous and everyone uses propaganda. In political propaganda, your main message is something other than the information you're conveying. Fascist propaganda is a very particular structure. It's based around a friend-enemy distinction. The political opponent, they are a merciless threat to your very existence and your traditions. They are the other. When they are in charge, it subverts the nation. So the structure of fascist propaganda is based on the idea that the other are fundamentally opposed to the nation. As Hitler says in Mein Kampf, science is only useful insofar as it strengthens the nation. Fascism is a cult of the leader. It involves the leader setting the rules about what's true and false. So any kind of expertise, reality, all of that is a challenge to the authority of the leader. If science would help him, then he can say, okay, I'll use it. Institutions that teach multiple perspectives on history in all its complexity are always a threat to the fascist leader. The center of democracy is truth. You're not free if you've been lied to. Nobody thinks the people of North Korea are free. The people of North Korea will vote for dear leader every time because they've been lied to. It's not a free vote because they don't have access to the truth. Equality similarly requires truth. Because equality in democracy doesn't mean we all have the same amount of money. It doesn't mean we all have the same car. It means political equality, that each of our voices matters the same. And political equality means speaking truth to power. If someone really powerful is humiliated when they're caught lying, that's the core of political equality. So if you're gonna rip the heart out of democracy, you get people used to lies. Here's a fact about humans. We all pretty much suck to the same degree. One group of us is not better than another group of us. Hierarchy is central here because it's the big lie at the center of things. What is racism but one big lie? Racism is the lie that one group is better than another. You're told this religion is better, this race is better, this gender is better. It's really a moral claim, has more moral worth. And then once you have hierarchy set up, you can make people very nervous and frightened about losing their position on that hierarchy. Hierarchy goes right into victimhood because once you convince people that they are justifiably higher on the hierarchy, then you can tell them that they're victims of equality. German Christians are victims of Jews. White Americans are victims of Black American equality. Men are victims of feminism. Once you convince people that they should be better, that they have earned a position on the hierarchy over others, then you can tell them that equality is actually victimhood. Loyalty to the dominant group means law-abidingness. And the minority group is by its nature not law-abiding. Law and order in fascist politics means the members of the minority group who accept their subservient role, they're law-abiding. And the members of the dominant group, by their very nature, are law-abiding. By definition, the leader can't violate law and order. So law and order doesn't mean justice. Law and order doesn't mean equality. Law and order structures who's legitimate and who's not. Everywhere around the world, no matter what the situation is, in very different socioeconomic conditions, the fascist leader comes and tells you, your women and children are under threat. You need a strong man to protect your families. They make conservatives hysterically afraid of transgender rights or homosexuality, other ways of living. These are not people trying to live their own lives. They're trying to destroy your life, and they're coming after your children. What the fascist politician does is they take conservatives who aren't fascist at all, and they say, look, I know you might not like my ways. You might think I'm a womanizer. You might think I'm violent in my rhetoric, but you need someone like me now. You need someone like me because homosexuality, it isn't just trying for equality. It's coming after your family. Fascist movements typically, though not invariably, rest on an urban-rural divide. The cities are where there's decadence, where the elites congregate, where there's immigrants, there's criminality, there's Sodom and Gomorrah. In the city, there's not real work. The pure, hardworking, real members of the nation live in the rural areas where they work hard with their hands. When our politicians talk about inner city voters or urban voters, we all know what they mean. Arbeit macht frei, work shall make you free. This was written on the gates of Auschwitz. The idea is that the minority group, they're lazy and they need to be made to work. Free labor. The minority group and the leftists, they're lazy by their nature, and it gives them a work ethic. Labor unions are run by communists who are trying to make things easier. Hard work is a virtue. In liberal democracy, we don't value people by how hard they work. What would happen to disabled people who can't work? They would then have no value. It's why the Nazis had the T4 program to murder the disabled, because the disabled were lebensunwertiges Leben, life unworthy of life, because to be valued was to be capable of hard work. Each of these individual elements is not in and of itself fascist, but you have to worry when they're all grouped together. When honest conservatives are lured into fascism by people who tell them, look, it's an existential fight. I know you don't accept everything we do, you don't accept every doctrine, but your family is under threat. Your family is at risk. So without us, you're in peril. Those moments are the times when we need to worry about fascism.
The dangers of the radical right extremism. The rise of the radical right extremism is a serious threat to democratic societies and human rights. The rhetoric of fear, division, and dehumanization often employed by these figures leads to increasingly violent authoritarian policies. The normalization of hate speech and violence toward marginalized communities can create a climate where the discriminatory laws and actions are accepted, such as we saw in the rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Much like Adolf Hitler's use of propaganda to stir up nationalistic fervor and xenophobia, modern extremist leaders manipulate public opinion to undermine social cohesion, encourage hostility towards outgroups, and justify cruel and unusual punishments. These leaders often target the most vulnerable in society: immigrants, minorities, and LGBTQ+ individuals. In effort to consolidate power and perpetuate their agenda, the danger is that, over time, this rhetoric erodes moral and ethical standards, desensitizing society to the suffering of others. Let me play this clip.
Yo, I'm Mr. Beats. In 2010, when I was a young lad, I began teaching world history at Blue Valley High School. Fun fact, that was the same high school that Michael Stevens from Vsauce went to. Anyway, when I first started teaching about fascism to these poor kids, I had a hard time explaining it. When I looked online for definitions, it was hard to find a definition that was historically accurate. And when I did find one, it was just ridiculously complex. And since then, I've noticed that there are a lot of people who are confidently talking about fascism, but I don't think they actually know what it means.
The true fascists who are operating today in this country are of a different variety than the old fascists of Mussolini's day. They're the people who want to shut down debate on college campuses like Berkeley, what they're doing to Coulter, what they've done to Milo, others.
Because fascism, regardless of nation or time or leader, is a reaction against the left. It's a frustration with liberalism. It's a rejection of socialism and communism and Marxism and feminism and globalism and perceived weakness. It's a reactionary movement that's a bit outside the realm of conservatism, that forms an uneasy alliance with conservatives and centrist elites.
Fascism is a form of socialism, indeed, its most workable form. While the socialism of Marx mobilizes people on the basis of class, fascism mobilizes people by appealing to their national identity as well as their class. Fascists are socialists with a national identity.
To begin, let's take a look at what fascism is. Contemporary fascists share three core beliefs. 1. People of European heritage are or ought to constitute a biological, cultural, and political unity known as the white race, sometimes dog-whistled as Western culture. 2. Jews are masterminding the destruction of the white race through multiculturalism and non-white immigration, a plot that fascists call white genocide or ethnic replacement. 3. The only way to save the white race is to establish a white homeland, or ethno-state, from which non-whites and degenerates must be purged.
Rarely is a word so often misused or mischaracterized. So let's look at what fascism actually means. I meant to make this video a while ago, but I held back after my friend Tristan from Step Back History beat me to it. That's right. He beat Mr. Beat. Anyway, he released the video back in October 2017. Tristan does a great job, as he always does, but he mostly dives into the early history of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, and frankly, he was still a bit too vague with his definition of fascism. In the comments of his video, I attempted to simplify the definition of fascism just like I used to simplify it for my students in my world history classes. Fascism is essentially conform or else. Well, it got a lot of likes, so that's cool, but then the well actually crowd hopped on, and one of the responses from Eli A was, that's just authoritarianism. Not all authoritarians are fascists, but all fascists are authoritarians. And Eli kind of has a point. Maybe I simplified too much. Violence usually is associated with fascism, but not always. So let me revise. Fascism is the idea that the group is more important than the individual. Diversity is a threat to the group. Individualism is a threat to the group. Immigration is a threat to the group. Any new ideas could potentially be a threat to the group. Basically, anything that undermines the country, nation, or even ethnic group is a threat to the group. The people in a fascist society are expected to have limited choices and strict guidance. In other words, conform to the group. Some argue fascism had its roots in the Jacobin movement, with leaders of the French Revolution like Maximilien Robespierre. Others argue it had its roots as a backlash against the Enlightenment. During the Enlightenment, when more and more people were raving about individualism, laissez-faire economics, liberty, and equality, dudes like the British philosopher Thomas Carlyle were like, hold up, hierarchy is good, democracy is bad. Some are leaders, but most are followers. Absolute rulers were good for society. These ideas gained popularity during the late 1800s and early 1900s. To add to the backlash, social Darwinism, the idea that the evolutionary concept of natural selection also applied to human societies, became a big thing. This fit right in with what would eventually be called fascism. The term fascism wasn't used until 1915 by supporters of a guy you probably have heard of named Benito Mussolini. Mussolini started a group called the Fasci of Revolutionary Action and a newspaper called The People of Italy after he broke away from the Italian Socialist Party. As you may recall, this was smack dab in the middle of World War I, which Mussolini had fought in but had returned home after getting injured. With his newspaper and the Fasci of Revolutionary Action, Mussolini started a movement, and it grew in popularity, calling for things like continuing to fight in World War I, increasing militarism in general, and most importantly, nationalism. His followers proudly call themselves fascists, with a capital F. The Italian word fascio, meaning group, which comes from the Latin word fasces, which literally meant a bundle of sticks. One stick will bend and break. All the sticks together will stand strong. And yes, this became the symbol of the fascist party. Early fascists seemed kind of like socialists, calling for things like an 8-hour workday, a minimum wage, and a progressive tax that targeted the rich. However, many of them seemed to be fans of authoritarianism. Supporters who nicknamed themselves the Black Shirts turned to intimidation and violence to shut down critics of their movement. Ultimately, the fascists were able to take over Italy after the March on Rome in 1922, and Mussolini forcibly became prime minister and eventually dictator. Again, my main purpose of this video is to simplify what fascism is. To recap, fascism is the idea that the group is more important than the individual. Authoritarianism and totalitarianism are both useful tools of fascism, but they are not necessary for it to happen, I suppose. But the other reason for me making this video is my frustration with people just using whatever definition of fascism best promotes their cause or fits their political agenda. Even the Oxford English Dictionary gets it wrong.
An authoritarian and nationalistic right-wing system of government and social organization.
Fascism tends to be authoritarian, but it doesn't mean it has to be. It tends to be nationalistic, but it doesn't mean it has to be. It tends to be historically right-wing, but it doesn't mean it has to be. I mean, geez, Oxford English Dictionary, if you are getting it wrong, how is anyone else expected to get it right? The sad thing is that even though people use the word fascism to describe people they disagree with or they hate, they often are subconsciously cool with some aspects of it. Could this be you? Are you still confused about what fascism actually is? Well, here are some puppets to help illustrate ways that society can become fascist.
Oh wow, our government sucks. What is happening to our country?
Sorry, what did you say?
I didn't say anything.
You said our government sucks, and our country isn't going in the right direction.
I didn't mean it.
You are an enemy of the country. Take him away.
There is a group of people that is making this country lose its way, taking our jobs and making us less by being here. We have to get them out by whatever means necessary.
You!
Jim Jet from the Disassociated Press, why do you keep locking up people with blue hair?
We need to protect the state. We cannot keep a country going without breaking a few eggs. Speaking about breaking eggs, Jim Jet, that's the last question you're ever going to ask.
Everything is fine. People are not being taken away to detention centers, separated from their loved ones.
But isn't he just a human?
Human? He's our savior. We owe everything to him. I'd give my left arm to him if I hadn't already given my right arm at the factory.
Thank you to Paul and all the puppets of the Felt Show for helping me make this video. They are all terrific actors, very funny too.
The long-term impact on society, desensitization over time, as people are repeatedly exposed to the inflammatory rhetoric and images, they become less sensitive to the harm it causes. Racism, xenophobia, and other forms of hate become normalized, and even those who aren't directly involved in extremist groups may come to view those ideologies as acceptable. The banalization of evil takes hold, where cruelty is seen as justified or even necessary for the greater good. Disempowerment of minority groups. As marginalized groups are vilified and attacked, they face not only direct harm from discriminatory policies, but also a deeper systemic disenfranchisement. This impacts access to education, healthcare, voting rights, and economic opportunities. As these groups are pushed further to the margins, the social fabric of the country weakens, and civil rights are eroded. The threat of authoritarianism. The unchecked rise of radical right extremism can lead to the rise of authoritarian leaders who push through autocratic policies. If their agenda succeeds, they can fundamentally alter the democratic structures of the country, concentrating power in the hands of a few and disenfranchising the majority of the citizens. Let me play this clip.
I offend anybody today? I don't care. No one is better than President Trump. He was one badass president. Extraordinary work. Then I got angry again. Because even though they lost the election, they're still moving thousands of illegal aliens in this country every day. CBP One app still running. They're selling pieces of the border wall, for God's sakes, that you, the American taxpayers, paid for at a hefty price, and now we got Biden again. There is no smooth transition. They're going to destroy this country up to the last day they're in the Oval Office. But I got news for them. January 20th, the greatest president in my lifetime is going to walk into the Oval Office and take this country back. President Trump called me a few Fridays ago and says, okay, you've been bitching about the border for 4 years. You want to come fix it? I said, absolutely. I'm back. I got to learn how to retire. This is the second time I got unretired to come back for this president. But I love this president because he loves this country. I love this across this border under Joe Biden. But someday we're going to find out. And it's going to be a bad day for America. When that happens, we're going to have one badass president in the White House, and that's Donald Trump, who's going to make sure we respond appropriately. People always ask me why I take this so seriously. And people say, Tom Homan's a racist, Tom Homan's a national. Say whatever you want. I don't give a shit. Why do I care? I care because I stood in the back of a tractor trailer with 19 dead aliens that suffocated and baked to death, including a 5-year-old little boy that died in his father's arms. Throughout my career, I've seen tragedies, held dying children. I've seen dead aliens on the trail. Best day of my life was President Trump getting reelected to save lives. A secure border saves lives. Who do you think you are, coming to the greatest nation on earth and victimizing Americans? And millions of dollars in public services are being given to people.
One of the first rules in resistance to tyranny and authoritarianism is to not obey in advance. And sadly, Trump isn't even in office yet, and already many are obeying in advance, such as the ABC settlement, which they probably would have won if they would have took to court, and other examples as well. Others are just straight up jumping on board and trying to see what they can get out of the situation, like the whole Republican Party. But sadly, it also includes individuals like Democrat John Fetterman, who claims to have good intentions. However, the secrecy of their meetings and the shadiness involved, and the shadiness that's always involved with MAGA for that matter, and even their intentions overall are just, it's really hard to give him the benefit of that doubt for those reasons. When the MAGA mayhem fascist regime who claim one thing and then do another, such as Trump telling Meet the Press that his message will be about unity, and then with the same breath turning around and attacking immigrants and transgender people and Democrats. Everyone that opposes him or that's ever held him accountable and spoke the truth. Because frankly, Trump is not a nice person, and frankly, you don't have to even hype anything up about him. He does all the hype himself. I mean, really, you don't have to make him look bad. He makes himself look bad as they try to push this disinformation and propaganda about Democrats to try to make them look bad and defame them and confuse people. Well, not with Trump. He just, the facts are bad enough. Instead, Trump just lets his bigoted, racist, and homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic mouth run, which ironically in 2016 he promised to protect the LGBTQ community, just much like he promised to protect the women as he takes their rights away, just like he's trying to take the transgender rights away and many others. Again, this didn't support his fascist cult agenda or image when promised to protect LGBTQ community and walk that back. And in fact, he has repeated the same speeches verbatim as Hitler and even Mussolini and Stalin, literally not by accident. Let me play this clip.
In Jerusalem, on April 11th, 1961, Adolf Eichmann stood trial for crimes against humanity. Eichmann had been a Nazi official tasked with organizing the transport of over 1.5 million European Jews to ghettos and concentration camps. He was popularly described as an evil mastermind who orchestrated atrocities from a cushy German office, and many were eager to see the so-called desk murderer tried for his crimes. But the squeamish man who took the stand seemed more like a dull bureaucrat than a sadistic killer. The disparity between Eichmann's nature and his actions was unsettling for many viewers. But for philosopher Hannah Arendt, this contradiction inspired a disturbing revelation. Arendt was a German Jew who fled her homeland in 1933 after being briefly imprisoned by the German secret police. As a refugee in France and then the United States, she dedicated herself to understanding how the Nazi regime came to power, and more specifically, how it inspired so many atrocities. A common opinion at the time was that the Third Reich was a historical oddity, a perfect storm of uniquely evil leaders supported by German citizens looking for revenge after their defeat in World War I. But Arendt believed the true conditions behind this unprecedented rise of totalitarianism weren't specific to Germany. Throughout the 1950s, Arendt developed a theory of the human condition that divided life into three facets: labor, in which we satisfy our material needs and desires; work, in which we build the world's physical and cultural infrastructure; and action, in which we publicly articulate our values to collectively shape the world around us. It was this last facet, the life of action, that Arendt believed was under attack, both in Germany and many other industrialized societies. She saw modernity as an age ruled by labor, where individuals mainly appear in the social world to produce and consume goods and services rather than share ideas and shape communities. Arendt believed this had fostered societies and ideologies where individuals were seen only for their economic value rather than their moral and political capacities. She believed this isolated people from their neighbors and their sense of self. And in her 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt argued these conditions provided fertile ground for totalitarian regimes, which use fear and violence to increase isolation and make it dangerous to publicly engage as free-thinking political agents. In this lonely state, participating in the regime becomes the only way to recover a sense of identity and community. Arendt believed it was this kind of environment where Eichmann committed his crimes. Most people expected the Jewish German philosopher to judge the ex-Nazi harshly, but while she condemned his monstrous actions, Arendt saw no evidence that Eichmann himself was uniquely evil. She saw him as a distinctly ordinary man who considered diligent obedience the highest form of civic duty. And for Arendt, it was exactly this ordinariness that was most terrifying. Her point wasn't just that anyone could do what Eichmann did, but that his story suggested ordinary people could willingly accept their societal role, even when it contributed to genocide. Arendt called this phenomenon the banality of evil, and warned that it can emerge whenever society inhibits our ability to think, or more specifically, to question our beliefs and actions in a self-reflective internal dialogue. Arendt believed this kind of thinking is the only way to confront moral problems, and that our responsibility to self-reflect is especially important when independent thought is threatened. She acknowledged that critical thinking in oppressive spaces is a defiant act that requires personal courage, but it must be done regardless, which is why Arendt still held Eichmann accountable. This thread runs throughout Arendt's work, where she continually insisted that thinking was our greatest weapon against the threats of modernity, namely, a relentless drive for economic and technological development, which would increase social alienation and inhibit human freedom. To foster this essential value, Arendt believed we need to create formal and informal forums that allowed for open conversations about shaping our collective future. These might include town hall meetings, self-governing workplaces, or student unions. But whatever shape they take, what's most important to Arendt is that they value open dialogue and critical self-reflection. Standing up for what's right in the face of injustice takes courage. Get to know the story of Irena Sendler, who smuggled 2,000 children out of the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II with this video.
In 1943, Allied aircraft swooped over Nazi Germany, raining tens of thousands of leaflets on people below. Written by anonymous Germans, the leaflets urged readers to renounce Hitler, to fight furiously for the future, and to never give up hope. Their call to action rippled through homes and businesses, and news of their message even reached concentration camps and prisons. It was only after the war had ended that the authors' identities, stories, and tragic fate would come to light. When Hitler seized power 10 years earlier, Hans and Sophie Scholl were teenagers in the town of Forchtenberg. At that time, fear, propaganda, and surveillance kept all aspects of life for the Scholl family and millions of other Germans under Nazi control. The government specifically targeted young people, setting up institutions to regulate their behavior and police their thoughts. As teenagers, Hans was a member of the Hitler Youth, and Sophie joined the League of German Girls. Hans rose through the ranks and oversaw the training and indoctrination of other young people. In 1936, he was chosen to carry the flag at a national rally. But when he witnessed the zeal of Nazi rhetoric, he began to question it for the first time. Meanwhile, Sophie was also starting to doubt the information she was being fed. Their parents, Robert and Magdalena, who had feared they were losing their children to Nazi ideology, encouraged these misgivings. At home, Robert and Magdalena listened to foreign radio stations that the government first discouraged and later banned. While the government churned out national broadcasts which denied Nazi atrocities, the Scholls learned shocking truths. And yet they were still subject to the rules of life in Hitler's Germany. After the outbreak of war, Sophie reluctantly worked for the national effort, and Hans had to take on army duties while attending medical school in Munich. That was where Hans met Christoph Probst, Willy Graf, and Alexander Schmorell. Day by day, each grew more sickened by Nazi ideology. They longed to share their views, but how could they spread them when it was impossible to know who to trust? And so, the friends decided to rebel anonymously. They pooled their money and bought printing materials. An acquaintance let them use a cellar under his studio. In secret, they began drafting their message. In June 1942, mysterious anti-Nazi leaflets began appearing all over Munich. They were signed The White Rose. The first leaflet denounced Hitler and called for Germans to sabotage the war effort. Adopt passive resistance. Block the functioning of this atheistic war machine before it is too late. Before the last city is a heap of rubble, before the last youth of our nation bleeds to death. Don't forget that each people gets the government it deserves. At a time when a sarcastic remark could constitute treason, this language was unprecedented. It was written mostly by Hans Scholl. In 1942, Sophie came to Munich knowing nothing of her brother's activities. She soon encountered the leaflets at school. But it was not until she discovered evidence in Hans's room that she realized who'd written them. Her shock soon gave way to resolve. She wanted in. For both siblings, it was time to escalate the fury that had been brewing for years. From June 1942 to February 1943, the group worked feverishly. While the Gestapo searched for leads, the White Rose were constantly on guard. The war raged on. Regulations tightened, and Munich suffered air raids, but the White Rose ventured deeper into conspiracy. They graffitied buildings and braved trains swarming with Gestapo. In the winter of 1942, Hans made a treacherous journey to the Czechoslovakian border to meet anti-Nazi rebels. On February 18, 1943, Sophie and Hans brought a suitcase of leaflets to their university. A custodian noticed what they were doing and reported them to the Gestapo. Both calmly denied any involvement until the police gathered all the leaflets and placed them back in the empty case, where they fit perfectly. When Hans and Sophie confessed, they were immediately led to court and sentenced to death by guillotine. Despite a grueling interrogation, the two refused to betray their co-conspirators. Before her execution, Sophie declared her fury at the state of her country, but she also spoke to a more hopeful future. How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give himself up individually to a righteous cause? Such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter, if through us, thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action? Ever wonder how Hitler rose to power in the first place? Find out with this video.
How did Adolf Hitler, a tyrant who orchestrated one of the largest genocides in human history, rise to power in a democratic country? The story begins at the end of World War I. With the successful Allied advance in 1918, Germany realized the war was unwinnable and signed an armistice ending the fighting. As its imperial government collapsed, civil unrest and worker strikes spread across the nation. Fearing a communist revolution, major parties joined to suppress the uprisings, establishing the parliamentary Weimar Republic. One of the new government's first tasks was implementing the peace treaty imposed by the Allies. In addition to losing over a tenth of its territory and dismantling its army, Germany had to accept full responsibility for the war and pay reparations, debilitating its already weakened economy. All this was seen as a humiliation by many nationalists and veterans. They wrongly believed the war could have been won if the army hadn't been betrayed by politicians and protesters. For Hitler, these views became obsession, and his bigotry and paranoid delusions led him to pin the blame on Jews. His words found resonance in a society with many anti-Semitic people. By this time, hundreds of thousands of Jews had integrated into German society, but many Germans continued to perceive them as outsiders. After World War I, Jewish success led to ungrounded accusations of subversion and war profiteering. It cannot be stressed enough that these conspiracy theories were born out of fear, anger, and bigotry, not fact. Nonetheless, Hitler found success with them. When he joined a small nationalist political party, his manipulative public speaking launched him into its leadership and drew increasingly larger crowds. Combining anti-Semitism with populist resentment, the Nazis denounced both communism and capitalism as international Jewish conspiracies to destroy Germany. The Nazi Party was not initially popular. After they made an unsuccessful attempt at overthrowing the government, the party was banned, and Hitler jailed for treason. But upon his release about a year later, he immediately began to rebuild the movement. And then in 1929, the Great Depression happened. It led to American banks withdrawing their loans from Germany, and the already struggling German economy collapsed overnight. Hitler took advantage of the people's anger, offering them convenient scapegoats and a promise to restore Germany's former greatness. Mainstream parties proved unable to handle the crisis, while left-wing opposition was too fragmented by internal squabbles. And so, some of the frustrated public flocked to the Nazis, increasing their parliamentary votes from under 3% to over 18% in just 2 years. In 1932, Hitler ran for president, losing the election to decorated war hero General von Hindenburg. But with 36% of the vote, Hitler had demonstrated the extent of his support. The following year, advisors and business leaders convinced Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor, hoping to channel his popularity for their own goals. Though the chancellor was only the administrative head of parliament, Hitler steadily expanded the power of his position. While his supporters formed paramilitary groups and fought protesters in the streets, Hitler raised fears of a communist uprising and argued that only he could restore law and order. Then, in 1933, a young worker was convicted of setting fire to the Parliament building. Hitler used the event to convince the government to grant him emergency powers. Within a matter of months, freedom of the press was abolished, other parties were disbanded, and anti-Jewish laws were passed. Many of Hitler's early radical supporters were arrested and executed along with potential rivals. And when President Hindenburg died in August 1934, it was clear there would be no new election. Disturbingly, many of Hitler's early measures didn't require mass repression. His speeches exploited people's fear and ire to drive their support behind him and the Nazi Party. Meanwhile, businessmen and intellectuals wanting to be on the right side of public opinion endorsed Hitler. They assured themselves and each other that his more extreme rhetoric was only for show. Decades later, Hitler's rise remains a warning of how fragile democratic institutions can be in the face of angry crowds and a leader willing to feed their anger and exploit their fears.
And in conclusion, the manipulation of public opinion through coded language, false promises, and even dehumanization is a grave threat to human rights, equality, and democracy. When such leaders rise to power, they can lead a society into a dangerous cycle of oppression and violence, very much reminiscent of the darkest chapters of our history. It's critical that societies remain vigilant recognize the tactics of manipulation, and push back against the forces of hate, fear, and division to protect the values of freedom, equality, and dignity for all people. And thank you very much for supporting my video. Hopefully you learned something that you didn't already know. Also, again, if I could just have you subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, smash the like button, share on your platforms. And for those of you who are able to, I'll link the GoFundMe in the description box below. I also have a lifestyles channel as well that I'll link in the description box if you want to check that out. It's non-political, so that's always fun too. So thank you again for supporting my channel. As always, be kind to yourself, be kind to others, and have a blessed day.